Jawaharlal Nehru, Christmas 1935. Kamala's condition took a turn for the better. It was not very marked, but after the strain of the past weeks, we experienced great relief. She had got over that crisis and stabilized her condition, and that in itself was a gain. This continued for another month, and I took advantage of it to pay a brief visit to England with our daughter Indira. I had not been there for 8 years, and many friends pressed me to visit them. I came back to Bevenweller and resumed the old routine. Winter had come, and the landscape was white with snow. As Christmas approached, there was a marked deterioration in Kamala's condition. Another crisis had come, and it seemed that her life hung by a mere thread. During those last days of 1935, I plunged my way through snow and slush, not knowing how many days or hours she would live. The calm winter scene with its mantle of white snow seemed so like the peace of cold death to me, and I lost all my past hopeful optimism. But Kamala fought this crisis also, and with amazing vitality survived it. She grew better and more cheerful and wanted us to take her away from Bevanville. She was weary of that place. And another factor which made a difference was the death of another patient in the sanatorium who had sometimes sent flowers to her and once or twice visited her. That patient, he was an Irish boy, had been much better than Kamala and was even allowed to go out for walks. We tried to keep the news of his sudden death from her, but we did not succeed. Those who are ill, and especially those who have the misfortune to stay in a sanatorium, seem to develop a sixth sense which tells them much that is short to be hid for them. In January 1, I went to Paris for a few days and paid another brief visit to London. Life was pulling at me again, and news reached me in London that I had been elected for a second time president of the Indian National Congress, which was to meet in April. I had been expecting this, as a friend has forewarned me, and I had even discussed it with Kamala. It was a dilemma for me to leave her as she was or to resign from the presidency. She would not have me resign. She was just a little better, and we thought that I could come back to her later. At the end of January 1936, Kamala left Badenweiler and was taken to sanatorium near Lausanne in Switzerland. Death. Both Kamala and I liked the change to Switzerland. She was more cheerful, and I felt a little more at home in that part of Switzerland which I knew fairly well. There was no marked change in her condition, and it seemed that there was no crisis ahead. She was likely to continue as she was for a considerable period, making perhaps slow progress. Meanwhile, the call of India was insistent, and friends there were pressing me to return. My mind grew restless and ever more occupied with the problems of our country. For some years, I had been cut off by prison or otherwise from active participation in public affairs. I was straining at the leash. My visit to London and Paris and news from India had drawn me out of my shell, and I could not go back into it. I discussed that matter with Kamala and consulted the doctor. They agreed that I should return to India, and I booked my passage by the Dutch KLM airline. I was to leave Lausanne on February 20th. After all this had been fixed up, I found that Kamala did not at all like the idea of my leaving her, and yet she would not ask me to change my plans. I told her that I would not make a long stay in India, and hoped to return after 2 or 3 months. I could return even earlier if she wanted me to. A cable would bring me by air to her within a week. 4 or 5 days remained before the date fixed for my departure. Indira, who was at school at Beck's nearby, was coming over to spend those last days with us. The doctor came to me and suggested that I should postpone my return by a week or 10 days. More he would not say. I agreed immediately and made another reservation in a subsequent KLM plane. As these last days went by, a subtle change seemed to come over Kamala. The physical condition was much the same, so far her physical environment. She would tell me that someone was calling her or that she saw some figure or shape enter the room when I saw no one. Early in the morning of February 28th, she breathed her last. Indira was there, and so was our faithful friend and constant companion during those months, Dr. M. Atal. A few another friends came from neighboring towns in Switzerland, and we took her to the crematorium in Lausanne. Within a few minutes, that fair body and that lovely face, which used to smile so often and so well, were reduced to ashes. A small urn continued the mortal remains of one who had been vital, so bright and so full of life. Mussolini returned. The bond that kept me in Lausanne and Europe was broken, and there was no need for me to remain there any longer. Indeed, something else within me was also broken, the realization of which only came gradually to me, for those days were black days for me and my mind did not function properly. Indira and I went to Montreux to spend a few quiet days together. During our stay at Montreux, I had a visit from the Italian consul at Lausanne, who came over especially to convey to me Signor Mussolini's deep sympathy to my loss. I was a little surprised, for I had not met Signor Mussolini or had any other contacts with him. I asked the consul to convey my gratitude to him. Some weeks earlier, a friend in Rome had written to me to say that Signor Mussolini would like to meet me. There was no question of my going to Rome then, and I said so. Later, when I was thinking of returning to India by air, that message was repeated, and there was a touch of eagerness and insistence about it. I wanted to avoid this interview, and yet I had no desire to be discourteous. Normally, I might have got over my distaste for meeting him, for I was curious also to know what kind of man the deuce was. But the Abyssinian campaign was being carried on them, and my meeting him would inevitably have led to all manner of inferences and would be used for fascist propaganda. No denial from me would go far. I knew of several recent instances when Indian students and others visiting Italy had been utilized against their wishes and sometimes even without their knowledge for fascist propaganda. And then there had been the bogus interview with Mr. Gandhi, which the Giornale d'Italia had published in 1931. I conveyed my regrets, therefore, to my friend and later wrote again and telephoned to him to avoid my possibility of misunderstanding. All this was before Kamala's death. After her death, I sent another message pointing out that, even apart from other reasons, I was in no mood then for an interview with anyone. All these instances on my path became necessary. As I was passing through Rome by the KLM and would have been spent an evening and night there, I could not avoid Oh, I could not avoid this passing visit and brief stay. After a few days at Montreux, I proceeded to Geneva and Marseilles, where I boarded the KLM airliner for the East. On arrival in Rome in the late afternoon, I was met by a high official who handed me a letter from the safety cabinet of Signor Mussolini. The Duke, it stated, would be glad to meet me, and he had fixed 6 o'clock that evening for the interview. I was surprised and reminded him of my previous messages, but he insisted that it had now all been fixed up and the arrangement could not be upset. Indeed, if the interview did not take place, there was every likelihood of his being dismissed from his office. I was assured that nothing would appear in the press and that I need only see the Duke for a few minutes. All that he wanted to do was to shake hands with me, to convey personally his condolences at my wife's death. So we argued for a full hour with all courtesy on both sides, but with increasing strength. It was a most exhausting hour for me, and probably more so far for other party. The time fixed for the interview was at last upon us, and I had my way. A telephone message was sent to a Duke's palace that I could not come. That evening I sent a letter to Signor Mussolini expressing my regret that I could not take advantage of his kind invitation to me to see him, and thanking him for his message of sympathy. I continued my journey. At Cairo there were some old friends to meet me, and then further east. Over the deserts of Western Asia, various incidents and the arrangements necessary for my journey had so far kept my mind occupied, but after leaving Cairo and flying hour after hour over this desolate desert area, a terrible loneliness gripped me and I felt empty and purposeless. I was going back alone to my home, which was no longer home for me, and there by side was a basket, and that basket contained an urn. That was all that remained of Kamala, and all our bright dreams were also dead and turned to ashes. She is no more. Kamala is no more. My mind kept me repeating. I thought of my autobiography, that record of my life, which I had discussed with her as she lay in Bovali Sanatorium. And I was writing it. Sometimes I would take a chapter or two and read it out to her. She had only seen or heard a part of it. She would never see the rest, nor would we write any more chapter together in the book of life. When I reached Baghdad, I sent a cable to my publishers in London who were bringing out my autobiography, giving them the dedication for the book, to Kamala, who is no more. Karachi came, and crowds and many familiar faces, and then Allahabad, where we carried the precious urn to the swift-flowing Gangas and poured an ashes into the bosom of that noble river. How many of our forebears she had carried thus to the sea? How many of those who follow us will take that last journey in the embrace of our water?